But it is a long, exhausting fight. I'm married, but how can you let it go when you know there's so many injustices and things that's going on? So
If I think back to 2013, like I think ahead of time, like what Kim did at her school, I think is what you need to do at every school, like straight away, is like really get parents involved and to get students doing lessons on those types of things and looking at that, um, and like highlighting the things in their school and why their school matters for their neighborhood and getting communities involved. And so
so
that's
now we have the parents coming in, and a couple of times in my class, I wrote the lesson plan is, oh, parents will come in to hear their child give a speech, which really they were coming in to practice their speech with the child.
involved. And
And
so that's
so
a huge step. And we need to, as educators, we got to do a better job with parents, anyways, making them feel involved and welcome in the school. In a way, to do that is fight to keep that school open.
and parents were involved more in their education than what they were before. So with
But I think anytime that you can get student voices, right, parent voices, and also like teachers like not being afraid to like use our voice and our power, is huge.
Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started, all the online folks and folks in person. So this is just to make sure you're in the right place, the Seattle DSA meeting of Save Our Schools Working Group. We're all part of here at Seattle DSA. We're trying to win a better future for schools and everyone, all working people. And so we have called this working group to try and figure out how to do that, basically, especially given that this year, at least initially, the plan was to close 20 schools here in Seattle, which was, I mean, I haven't run the numbers exactly, but like probably per capita, Chicago, I know you have this beat in terms of pure numbers, 50 schools, but 20 schools, we're a smaller city over here. So that's, but it would have been a really big closure. So, but that's, many things have changed since then. So we're kind of here in the mix as things develop. So, I mentioned Chicago because that's a place where this has happened before. Chicago, in case you don't know, they're going to give you more info on it, more than I ever could. But when you talk about school closures, Chicago is the place that gets mentioned most often. 50 schools in 2013, about 10 years ago or so. And C2, big, strong, powerful teachers union that we aspire to. Literally, books have been written about Chicago teachers and what they can do to stop school closures. So we thought that given the situation here in Seattle, it would be beneficial to hear from some Chicago teachers. So we have two Chicago teachers here who I do not know, and whose names I am only going to guess at pronouncing. They look easy though. We have Dave, is it Stieber?
Yeah, hey, it's Stieber. Yep.
Stieber, nailed it. Okay, and Kim Walls as well, who are going to give us at least to start, just a little rundown about what it's been like being in CTU, what the school closures were like.
Okay. Well, hey everyone, thanks for having us. Kim and I have known each other a long time, and within CTU, I've taught one of her family members way back when, and we were on TV together way back when, it's like a long time ago. So I started teaching in 2007. This is year 18. And actually in Chicago, we've had over 100 schools closed since 2001. Arnie Duncan, Paul Vallis, and a lot of neoliberal education privatizers created this plan called Renaissance 2010 back in 2000. And it was to close 100 schools over the course of that decade. And they did that. Everyone makes a big deal about the 50 schools in 2013. But it was over 100 schools over that time period before that as well. It was consolidations, closures, turnarounds, all targeting like the Black community primarily. And so the first school I took a job at in 2007, I didn't know anything about the CPS politics and the history of closures and all those things. And so I took a job at a brand new public school called Team Inglewood. And not knowingly, that school replaced Inglewood Tech Prep, which is the school that was closed, like the first major closer in Chicago. And that's actually how the core caucus came about, because Jackson Potter, our current vice president, Stacey Davis Gates, our current president at CTU, both taught at that school. And they started speaking out about that and got community involved. And Karen Lewis, who was our CTU president, didn't teach there, but that's kind of where she started fighting for that school. So that school closed. It was being phased out. So every year they didn't take a new year. And so my first year at Team Inglewood in 2007 was Inglewood Tech's preps last year. So there was about 20 seniors left in the building. And so we were freshmen in the building, and they split the building vertically in half with our new public school in there and a charter school. And so there was 3 schools in this building, split vertically. They painted half the building red, half the building purple. And this was in a neighborhood that had been disinvested and defunded in. And so literally they created gang lines in the building between the 2 schools. And so that year was really challenging. And as a social studies teacher and a teacher that learned from people who stand up and do amazing things, I went to a Teachers for Social Justice conference that first year, and Jackson Potter had students from Inglewood there. And I walked into this meeting and they were like talking about all this stuff. And I'm like, oh my God, I just took a job in a school and I'm helping essentially to close a school and part of this whole process unknowingly. And I felt absolutely shitty and terrible. And I was like, I need to quit teaching like now. And then so that was in 07. That school, ironically, not funnily, was closed in 2016. So that school replaced Inglewood, which then with that new school, Team Inglewood, was then closed, defunded and closed in 2016. So I left in 2014, 2 years before it closed, and I had seen staff cut, budget cuts, broken computer labs, nurses not there, tracks that kids couldn't run on. I mean, everything, right? And so I took a job at a school that was essentially the start of Core Caucus's fight in Chicago Teachers Union. And then I saw my same school be closed and defunded. And so that's like a microcosm of the struggle that it's been. And so it's not, 2013, we can talk about all the things that happened in 2013, the marches, the arrests that we did, the mass actions that we did, the protests at, the fake city meetings that they would host in churches. And they would literally, the CPS officials would get up in Black churches on the altar and speak to the audience like they were essentially, the pastor. And it was super messed up. And so, it's like school closures. It's still one of the worst things I've ever experienced. Like we went to a school closure hearing because the school I taught at, Team Inglewood, the reason it closed is because they closed all the elementary schools that fed into it in 2013. So surprise, surprise, a few years later, there's no kids coming to that school, right? And so in 2013, we went to the school closure hearing, and it was like little kids on a school night, right? They would be like, please don't close our school. And it'd be like their whole school's band, right? Be like, look at our amazing band program, right? And like all these little kids taking field trips on a school night in the middle of winter to advocate for their school to be kept open. And it still gives me like goosebumps in the worst way. Just picturing that. And I remember vividly in class asking my students, how many of you went to one of these schools that is now on the closure list before they closed them all? Every single kid raised their hand. And I was like, okay, how are you guys feeling? And like very like ashamedly, they were like feeling like they went to a failing school, like they weren't smart because they went to this school on this closure list. So it absolutely decimated morale. It decimated communities. I mean, there's still empty school buildings in Chicago. And so if you speak to Stacy, our president, or like anyone that's ever experienced school closure, it's like one of the pivotal moments of, our adult lives, like seeing it, experiencing it, talking to kids about it. And so I can still feel the emotion coming back. And so it's like something that you must fight absolutely tooth and nail, because it'll radically change your district, your neighborhoods, and all those types of things too.
Well, thank you, Dave. That's a pretty sobering look at it. Yeah, and even I wasn't aware. I know the 50 number, but to hear that it was, that he was even part of a larger plan of 100 schools is quite shocking. Kim, what do you have to add to this? Can you tell us about your experience with CTU and core and closing schools? And
Yeah, how you all doing this evening? It's 8:17 for me, so excuse me. So I was I went through two school closings. We won one, and they came back like I want to say a year later, and closed us. So I went to Guggenheim Elementary. It was on the south side of Chicago, and it was my first year there. So Dave started in 2007. I was officially in CPS in 2008 because I have my alternative certification through the Academy of Urban School Leadership. And they were some of the people who were participating in the school closure. So like Dave, you just don't know because I'm originally from Gary, Indiana. And I taught over in Indiana. And so to teach over in Chicago, when I moved over here, outside of taking the praxis over in Indiana, I had to transfer over here. So I took the alternative certification. So like Dave, I knew nothing about the politics either in Chicago, and the politics in Chicago is very different than the politics in other places, but you learn pretty quick once you pushed in to those waters. So 2009, I think it was, that is when I met Jackson and Jesse, is when we learned that our school was closing. And I was not a tenured teacher. So in Chicago, it's a big deal to become a tenured teacher because you can kind of get clicked. They call it clicked. You can get let go. So you have to kind of maneuver in the background, kind of, so to speak. But I was real blessed in the fact that the principal and the assistant principal, mainly the assistant principal, Gervais Clay, who's now a Chicago Teachers Union field rep, she was my assistant principal. She hired me. When they closed Guggenheim the first time, I believe it was under CEO Ron Huberman. I don't want to call out no names because I don't want to mistaken the CEOs, because we've worked under several CEOs during the school closure experience. So we took a different approach to our school closing. Our approach was, how can we talk about school closing and advocate for the students without getting in trouble, if I could say it that way, without losing instructional time. So at the time, I was a middle school 6th, 7th, 8th social science and writing teacher. So we created lesson plans around activism. And I'm saying we because it was a cross-curricular type of event, and we created field trips. So we were trying to find ways to advocate to keep our school open while on the clock. And the best way to do that was to create these lesson plans and attach the field trip to the lesson plan. And then Jackson and Jesse will always come with this bright idea and say, hey, why don't you all just come on, let's go downtown. And we're like, okay, but to go downtown on CPS's dime, we had to create a lesson plan around a field trip. And we had to actually apply to get the buses and things like that. So the reading teacher, I was teaching activism. I taught about Little Rock 9. I talked about Ruby Bridges. I talked about the Black Panther movement and how the lunch, the free meals and stuff got started. And then in the reading class, they were reading about it. But in the social science class, we were making posters. We were practicing speeches. We were creating leaflets. And so it got to the point where we almost forgot we were closing because we became so involved in the activism part of it that we forgot what the original mission was. And so kids were beginning to practice their speeches when they would go downtown, because like Dave said, we would have to get on the bus late at night, 6 or 7 o'clock, and go downtown to speak at a hearing. And so if you can imagine, you have bus loads of kids. And then we're not talking about 6 and 7. We had siblings, 2nd grade, 3rd grade. And then we had to get our parents involved. So that was, so we're trying to now think of how can we get our parents involved. And what we did was we started having kids go home, practice the speech in front of the parent, and the parent would sign off and say, yeah, they practice speech in front of me. And every now and then a parent would come up to the school and say, well, my child said this. And so that began to get other parents talking, because now when we were at dismissal, we got the sidewalk conversations going. So now we got the lesson plans, we got the field trips, but how do you get people downtown? Food. So we started putting our money together to feed families. Because if we're downtown late, or if we're downtown at lunch, we have parents for chaperones. We're in a a neighborhood that's low income, we started feeding parents. And so parents started getting more active, not just because we were feeding them, because they were seeing this is actually serious, this is real, because at first parents aren't paying attention because they're working. If they're not working, they're trying to figure out how to keep the lights on. And so, you know, your kids are becoming their kind of the hub of the situation. And so how can we bring parents in? How can we have these parent meetings to let parents know? Then you have parents that can't read. You have parents that can't write. You have parents that know what they want to say, but don't know how to formulate what they want to say. So we started practicing that too. So now we have the parents coming in, and a couple of times in my class, I wrote the lesson plan is, parents will come in to hear their child give a speech, which really they were coming in to practice their speech with the child. And so we had a couple of hearings. And once you get past one hearing with a kid, we put the eighth graders would go first. They would get up and speak. And, you know, once they did a couple of speeches, it almost became a competition with who could get up to the podium and speak the best. And so they created a competition out of that. And then we would ask the parents to go up and stand behind their child while they're giving a speech. So that gave the parents more empowerment, and it gave the kids more empowerment. And before you knew it, we were able to sit back as teachers and let the parents and kids take over. So it really became, students learned how to do public speaking. Students knew how to walk up to people downtown. At one point, we were downtown and you saw nothing but yellow flyers all over the ground, because our kids were literally forcing people to take the flyer, because how are you going to deny a flyer out of the hand of a child? But they will glance at it and throw it on the ground. But that's okay, because now we're trying to figure out why all these yellow sheets around downtown, around CPS headquarters. So that was a pretty big deal, in the fact that our kids' test scores were already good, but they went up. You know, because our kids were actually into the reading, they were actually into this public speaking, and that's when we gave the writing assessments. And I was the writing teacher, and they were actually into it. And so we won that fight that year. And so it was kind of it was a celebration. We won. The kids who are our eighth grade students went on, they took the selective, and in Chicago, you have to take a test to get into I don't want to say the upper echelon schools, but schools that are not in your neighborhood, that are not your neighborhood schools. They call them selective enrollment and magnet schools. And our kids did good on these tests, and parents were involved more in their education than what they were before. So with that crew of kids, it was kind of a blessing in disguise to let kids see the reality of what happens, you know, outside of school. And this is how what you're learning applies to what you may be involved in one day. And they became real activism. But the second time around, it was kind of, we were defeated, and we were tired. And a lot of teachers by then had left, because some had retired because they were exhausted from the first school closing. And when you don't have that fabric in the building, it's kind of hard to pick up that momentum of where you left off. So we had to figure that part out. And even I felt defeated, and I was like, I'm tired. It is what it is. Let me just try and get tenure. Matthew Luskin, who had just started at CTU, came to Guggenheim, and he walked right past myself and Cherie Dabney Parker. We worked together. And he said, hey, I'm here from CTU. You know, we were told that you're on the school closing. We were like, oh, we tired, we're going home. And we left. And he was shocked, because we got such glowing praises and celebrations from Jesse. You know, they couldn't believe that Matthew came to the school and we just shoved him off. And yeah, we got a phone call and was like, look, you all have to set the tone again. So those of us who were left had to do it all over again. So we had to find that energy. So now what did we do this time though? This time it was under Rahm Emanuel, and it was more, it was dehumanizing, and you feel defeated. And it was, we learned that they started paying, remember that day they started paying protesters $50. People just out of nowhere would come and get on a school bus and come to the hearing, and they would say that they're the parents of that school and they want the school closed. And so the first night that happened was over in off of 71st across from Bond. I think that church over there. And so when we walked in, we were looking at these people. We were like, who are these people? And we knew that they weren't our parents because we have a relationship with our parents. And so we were talking to Matthew, and we started talking to other people. And Cherie Dabney probably just walked up to him and, who are you? He said, I'm a parent of Guggenheim. Now, why you choose Guggenheim? It was a couple of schools there. Why do you say Guggenheim? And I turned around and said, no, you're not. And then Clay turned around and said, no, we in church. So we had to remember where we were. And so we found out from one of the individuals that they were actually paid $50 to come in and pretend as if they were the parents, you know. So that was a tactic, which was exposed in the Tribune. I don't know if it's the Chicago Tribune or the Sun-Times. It was exposed. But it is a long, exhausting fight. I'm married now, and my husband was my boyfriend at the time, and my daughter was a CPS student. He didn't get it. Why not just go to another school is what he would say. Why are you fighting this hard? You know, you're coming in tight, you're coming in with, and I did. I still have attitudes with CPS. I have a disdain for Chicago public schools. I really do. And even to this day, he says, you know, you really need to let it go. But how can you let it go when you know there's so many injustices and things that's going on? So long story short, the second time around, we were closed. And our kids felt defeated. And like Dave said, you know, they felt as though, you know, they did something wrong because their test scores weren't right. You know, maybe I should have came to school more. And they did. They started questioning things that they did. And we had to explain to them, it's nothing dealing with you. This is the politics of Chicago. This is how they disinvest. You know, this is how they want to take the money from our school and put it someplace else. So that was real hard. And for the following school year, we followed our kids. So even though I was at another school, the school that I'm at now, all of us took 10, 15 kids and said that we would follow them to the schools that they were transferred to. Some were transferred to Bond, and I think some to others, I think Wentworth. And we tried to make sure that those kids were acclimated and were in a safe space and were able to thrive where they were without the community that they had over at Guggenheim. So hope I gave it justice of what happened, but any questions?
Yeah, actually, I was gonna open it up if you guys can stick around. I know it's late in Chicago, but for a school night, but if you guys want to stick around for at least a little bit, I'm sure, you know, some people here have some questions after, I mean, I certainly do too, but I'll let other people, if you're here in the room, raise your hand. If you're on Zoom and your camera's on, you can raise your hand. If you're on Zoom and your camera's not on, you can press the raised hand button. But yeah, does anyone have any questions for our speakers here? Stefan, rearing up the back, go for it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kim and Dave, for being here. Just very simple question. How do you stop school closures? Knowing what you know, what would you do different? What's your advice for a union here in Seattle, for parents, for the wider community? What would be, what's the playbook? What are the things you would take from, oh, if I had known that 10 years ago, we would have been stronger, or just from your experience? What would you say? What's the key, or some keys, or at least some things that can give us hope?
Dave, you want to take that
I was
away?
gonna say you want to go first. All right. I'll tell
You can
you.
talk about the elected representative school boards.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like I can tell you like things that we did and the things that I think then you could kind of build it and make it your own. You know, when some of the stuff worked and some of the stuff didn't. I guess I should preface though too is that I mean the school closing is 2013, like we lost, right? Like, and there's no way to like frame that differently. But if I think about like what Kim just said with the elected representative school board, there's a lot of things that have come out of that. And a lot of the politics of the city that have changed, like our mayor has come out of that, Stacy's come out of that, Jackson, you know, like all the leadership that we're now seeing has come out of that. So that's a sidebar win, you know, but like not in a good way. I mean, in a good way, leadership, but not in a good way of how it got there. But if I think back to 2013, like I think ahead of time, like what Kim did at her school, I think is what you need to do at every school, like straight away, is like really get parents involved and to get students doing lessons on those types of things and looking at that, and like highlighting the things in their school and why their school matters for their neighborhood and getting communities involved. And so that's a huge step. And we need to, as educators, we got to do a better job with parents anyways, making them feel involved and welcome in the school. In a way, to do that is fight to keep that school open. One thing that I remember vividly is we organized, there was like a 3-day march. It was over, I think, Memorial Day weekend or some long weekend. And we literally went from as far south as Chicago goes. And you walked by, like walking during the day, every single school that was on the closing block from the south to the south, north, south, and west to the east. And that was like a really big, powerful event. People got arrested. We were downtown, we got arrested for that. I mean, just a lot of different like media, the ways to get media. But I think anytime that you can get student voices, right, parent voices, and also like teachers like not being afraid to like use our voice and our power, is huge. And so, building that the skill and the confidence and the welcomeness and like just the showing like what love looks like. And love is like fighting to keep your school open. Love is fighting to make sure that everyone feels included and welcome in that space too. And so I think just kind of like really kind of get to the humanization parts of all those things. I think now there's lots of different ways to do it now that there weren't available then, but also just kind of thinking about those same general things of that. I don't know if that is good enough, but just kind of thinking about those routes.
Yeah, so I would also add to that, build those alliances with those grassroots organizations so that you're not wearing yourself out. I remember it was Illinois Raise Your Hand. And I don't want to call no names out of that because Wendy, her name comes to mind, but then she elevated and went to another organization because she was also fighting school closures. There were several grassroots organizations around the city and within the community where people were sharing these local actions. So once you build those alliances, it's less exhausting and it's more empowering because you're not by yourself. So now you're building numbers. And then like it goes back to the politics. We were in Springfield, we were lobbying. We were at City Hall, we were lobbying. And I want to say, and Dave, help me out with this. I think it's safe to say that Stacey has built a beautiful political, I'm not gonna say it that way, but she built the political action power that we are, the powerhouse that we are. And she did that because she was in Springfield and she saw that the only way for us to move forward was to get involved in politics. And that was our city alderman. So now we have to let first it was, I'm a constituent, because we were not gonna, we were holding actions at certain aldermen's, I think you all may have city councilmen though, but we have aldermen. And so we were having actions at their doorstep because guess what? Elections around the corner. We are your voting constituents. And then we were having parents register to vote so that they can see that these parents have a voice. So that was another action that we took. And here we are back down in 2014, we finally have a mayor on the 5th floor. So it took us years to get to where we are, to where we're recognized that we have to have those individuals in those spaces to where they understand what we're trying to say so that we won't keep saying the same thing and not getting the fruits of our labor. And that's really what I would suggest. Build those alliances, get involved with your city politician. I don't know how your school board runs, but ours at the time, up until January, they're appointed by the mayor. So the mayor is the end all be all. And so since they were appointed by the mayor, it was, I think 2011 is when I heard about the elected representative school board. And it took us just that long to get it on the ballot, for us to be able to vote. And now we're able to get, November 5th is our first election where we can vote for school board members. And we were the only city, correct me all if I'm wrong on this, the only city in the state of Illinois, where we couldn't vote on our members. And that's because CPS is a cash cow. You know, so we learned about tax increment financing. We taught our students about that too. We taught our parents about that. So we did a lot of teaching. I did a lot of learning. And before you know it, you know, you're starting to educate people. And the more you educate them, you start to chip away at some of the political actions that are the disinvestments. And I remember Penny Pritzker. Oh, I live in Hyde Park in Chicago, and she was given tax increment financing to open up the Hyatt Hotel. And that literally came from, that was supposed to be our pension money. And so we created an action around that. And Obama had just gotten in office, and it was less than a half a mile from Obama's house. You know, so we did a protest, and I remember calling Matthew, and I want to say John Cusack was a part of that too. We left the protest because we're trying to figure out how can we get media attention on this. And it's like, hey, you know, we're about to, you know, go past Obama's house. And we were always trying to find ways to get media attention. And that was a good way. Here you have a Black president, but then you have these teachers in Chicago. He's from Chicago. The money went to Penny Pritzker, you know, who was a part, I don't know which time she was a part of his office though, but she was a part of his office at one point. And then we're coming through the University of Chicago to march over by him, and then you have Secret Service. So they're telling us to stay on one side of the street. So you just always trying to find ways to pull in some sort of media to get somebody's attention. So those are, I don't know if I helped you out, if I gave you a list in a roundabout way, but those are some ways that we did. And it was always, you know, Karen Lewis, you know, and her famous line was, you know, what do you do with the bully? You know, she would say, you take their power away. And I say this to this day to my colleagues, because I'm also a delegate. You know, if we're being bullied, we want to chip away that power. And that was one of the ways that they did a good job at chipping away the power.
Absolutely enormously helpful. Yes, thank you. I see, Juliana, you've got your hand raised and taking extensive notes. So take it away. Yeah, you have something for us?
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you both, Dave and Kim. I could listen to you all day. I feel like the more you talk, the more that my brain is lighting up. The fight in Chicago is so important. We look to you so often for how to get shit done, even though our worlds are vastly different. One of the biggest differences in this conversation is, I think, the excuse for why the schools are closing. And so in Seattle, it drops in enrollment because of parents moving to private schools. Rent is too damn high. Parents can't afford to live in Seattle. And that problem is like rippling out of the city of Seattle. But I don't think that really matters as far as our approach, because even if Chicago was about redistributing and wanting to put resources in other places just by the whims of the mayor and the controlling bullies, I don't think it matters, because at the end of the day, this is about, as you said, riling up and advocating from the bottom up. So I really want to lean into how the takeaway that parents were supporting their kids, that kids were doing these speeches and kids were getting fired up, and then parents saw that and then themselves getting involved. I think that's a really important piece. It's tough for us because the elementary schools that are on the chopping block are elementaries. That said, what you said early on, Kim, about Dave said about how at some point the high schools closed because the feeder schools closed. I don't know how the mapping actually works in the schools that are on the list of closure, but I think this is something that maybe we could look to get the high school students of the feeder schools that are going to be there, to get them involved in some way. And I think this is a really beautiful opportunity to point out that that test scores, fuck test scores, but they go up when the kids are invested in real world problems. And that's something that I think a lot of us have been fighting for a long time with standardized corporate education reform. So like project-based learning, community problems, if we can like pull that out and get our feeder schools in the secondary level, work with the teachers that are protected, that have we call, you know, continuing contracts, same thing as tenure essentially, get them to start those lessons and rile up the students at the higher grades, because the feeder schools, you know, are going to impact the enrollment at those schools at some point. But I also was really hopeful that you could talk about, in any way, shape, or form, has Chicago done anything with those empty buildings? You mentioned that there are still some schools that are just empty and closed. I've been feeling from the very beginning of this threat of the closure that these under-enrolled schools could become community hubs where services or community organizations are housed, or are, you know, like becoming those central energy spaces for neighborhoods. Could you talk about that at all? Has that happened in Chicago, where the schools are used for anything other than like formal compulsory education? And then that's like one question. And my last thing, I'm just going to say, like, a big difference that I see in where we are in our region versus Chicago is you all had a bully that were people. The mayoral control, you knew who your CPS admin targets were. In Washington state, our bully is regressive taxation. The fact that we have billionaires who don't pay taxes, and the underfunding, this the underperforming, all those pieces. So we have a kind of a little more esoteric like target, in that our Seattle public schools people try to posture as liberals that care a lot. We're trying to do the best. We're trying to we'll work with the parents, and we're responsive, blah, blah, blah. We have this like bigger threat that isn't quite so tangible. But I do wonder if you have any sort of advice or thoughts around what empty school buildings could become with those community alliances that you were talking about, because that is so incredibly important to make community schools be really the purpose and the function of a public school system. So sorry, that was kind of all over the place. I did take a lot of notes. I didn't say everything, but I just want to close by saying thank you, Kim and Dave, so very much for your time tonight, because listening to you, just the more that you talk, the more that I'm like, my brain is firing. And so yeah, the question really for you is there any possibility of like, how do you get empty school buildings or under-enrolled schools to become those community centers and those spaces that aren't necessarily like the educational space, but are more wraparound services for families?
That was a lot of question. All good. So back in 20, whenever it was 11 or 12, when they started making the announcement about school closings, it was this term underutilization, right? It was like this metric, right, that they use, that they would count the number of classrooms, whatever they considered a classroom in a building. Sometimes that would be like a literal, you know, office. And then they would divide that by the number of kids in the building. And if that metric didn't equal 30 per classroom, that school is considered underutilized. So I would be, you know, a little cautious of anyone that talks about underutilization in public education, because I should have 20 kids in a class, you know, I shouldn't have 30. Sorry, that was triggering just to think back to those terms and that bullshit. There was a middle part of all of that I was going to talk about, Juliana, and now I'm totally blanking on what that was. What was the middle? There was something in the middle that you said.
You know what you just said, I just want to capture, because the metric that the district is using is not clear or transparent. When they look at capacity for buildings, they're looking at a total number of students based on what you just said, overstuffed classrooms. So that actually was really valuable. The other part of just like, what else can you do with the building if it is underutilized by their metric?
Check that's what it was. And check that they're actually using classrooms as space. Like they legit would count like staff offices, or like you know, like lunchroom, like staff lunchrooms, like, as office, as those numbers, and they would say 30 kids should be in this room, right? And so just really push back on that, and really check that. I was on our current mayor's educational transition team, and one of the things that came out of that idea is the idea of community hubs, like you're talking about. Chicago has not done that. I mean, most of the buildings that were closed are still empty. There's one, I think they turned into high-end lofts or whatever like that, but you know, most is just an empty. And so I think if a building is actually underutilized, or I don't even like that word, but if there's actually space in the building and you can still keep the kids in the building and use the other half for what you're talking about, that's one of the things we had in our educational transition plan, is to have, like clinics and things in half of the building, daycares, right? And you could have the students then learn how to do those skills, those jobs, those things, while also giving services to the community. And so I think that's hugely amazing. And that would also really make schools be shown again how integral they are to the community as well. That it requires money. And our big thing now is our district is now saying, oh, we don't have money, we don't have money. And they have always said that. And so the state of Illinois, kind of like what you're speaking about, is admits it owes our schools more money. But our governor, who has done some good progressive things and is generally well liked, is not funding education, which is a pretty standard Democrat, like following line. And so now our target is going towards, our governor. We're gonna take out our CEO first on the way, but it is towards our governor to get for funding too. And so just really thinking about for us now, it's like, who's the roadblocks along the way? And so, we learned how to like target power map and all those types of things. And so, yeah, it's a state thing. One thing the CTU has done really well the last few years, like Kim was kind of talking about with Springfield, going down to Springfield for politics, is also kind of pushing the rest of the unions in Illinois to become more radical and push harder too, like the Illinois Federation of Teachers. Like we've kind of been like kicking them, like, let's go, and so they've kind of been coming along. And then you start to hear other stories of, oh, it's not just Chicago that has underfunded schools, it's, insert every city in the state, right? And then those stories kind of come along as well. And so, there's a lot of fights that are becoming more statewide than were before. And so that's one of the big pushes that we're doing in Chicago, but looking statewide and also nationally, because with our mayor being the mayor now, we are like the right wing national attack every day is on CTU and on Brandon because of CTU. And so when Karen Lewis was the CTU president, we were attacked for education, but now that Brandon's the mayor, we're attacked all the time by everyone. And so that's becoming another thing too. So we're just trying to create national allies as opposed to just, local city level. Now it's state and national. Your turn, Cam.
I was thinking I don't have nothing to add because I get pissed off when I go past a building. I think one of the buildings was turned into an apartment, no, a condo, and we were just, oh my gosh, I get so, yeah, I don't know how to say nothing without cussing. So I'm gonna pass on now because it really is hurtful because think about the trades, think about how we can educate kids. And we used to have a good CTE program when I first started with CPS, and they chipped away at that. Our driver's ed program, my daughter is a CPS graduate. And Dave taught my oldest daughter. But these are things, I don't want to say things, but these are some ways that the schools could have been utilized and they just chipped away at it. So no, I get pissed off when I think about how the school is just sitting there, and it's nothing there. And then yet, I always equate, we can't, eradicate crime, but we could decrease it through education. And when you disinvest in education, now we have kids just all over the place. Now you see kids 12, 13 years old. It was like the year before COVID, one of my students stole someone's phone off a CTA bus stop and came to school in Brampton. But I'm telling you, you do realize, I am a mandated reporter, but the thought process was what's going to happen, and he hardly came to school. And that was one of the things too, when I get to this new school, we had to build a relationship with the older person. We had to build a relationship with other grassroots organizations over there. We had to build a relationship with the cops and things over there and say, these are our kids. If you see them, can you please bring them back to school, or they ran and left the school? It's so much that happens, and to close the school and the building just sits there. And then you wonder why our kids are just running around rampant. Yeah, I get pissed off. I don't know how to add to that. I'm on a rant. I'm gonna be quiet.
We understand it completely. We definitely have a couple more questions.
Yeah,
Go
so
ahead.
thanks so much for your time and your expertise. Something that I think you mentioned was challenging for your fight, which I think we find challenging too, is the kind of game of whack-a-mole. So, you know, in Seattle, it started with 21 elementary schools or 17 on the block, and now they've changed it to 5, but with the the implication that those other schools will also close further down the line, but it does feel like the same kind of tactic of bait and switch, you know, try and defuse people's anger and kind of shift it somewhere else. And so while like in our school, you know, we're trying to generate that kind of activism that you're describing, that kind of feels short-sighted because the goal should be no school closures, right? And then, but once they start listing the schools, everybody's worried about their own school, their own community, rightly, you know, as they should be. And so it just feels like an impossible task sometimes to take on an agenda that you know is coming, and that they will just chop and change and switch out, you know, just depending on how people react in order to get it through. And that's just frustrating for me. Not really a question, just an observation. Thanks.
Yeah.
Because your efforts were amazing. I mean, I just in the amount of time that you would have had to come up with the ideas that you did and the plans that you did, and to involve the kids like that's amazing. And then, but then again, they take advantage of it. See you're burned out, come back in. You know, it's hard.
I think that's one thing that like we can highlight certain like things, like amazing things that Kim's done or that other people have done. But also like realize like it is like literally a continued struggle. Like there's never like, like people 2013, yes, was like a very pivotal moment, but like they were defunding schools, right? Way before that, right? And they were doing things that were super detrimental to our kids before all those things. And so there's lots of steps along the way before they decide they want to close a school, that really, that come into play. And man, my thoughts are just all over with this, kind of like how Kim's feeling. Like it's so traumatic and triggering and like all those things. And the one thing that like you just I don't even know I guess the fight, and the long answer is the fight like really never stops, and that's exhausting. And also like the organizing keeps improving and changing and or adapting. But like when you decide to teach in a public school, and if you decide to teach in the schools that have been in communities that have been defunded, like that's your commitment. And it really at times is really overwhelming, and beyond frustrating. And you want to like fight people because it's just like, how the fuck do you not care about our kids? But also at the same time realizing that like they have no clue. Like, and oftentimes people generally aren't trying to be jerks, but they just don't have a clue as to what some schools are like and how vastly different schools can be. And so, and the experience that kids have based on the zip code that they live in. And so really trying to make people aware of all those things. I mean, even the staff, making the staff aware of what the kids are experiencing, right? And before you even go talk to, the community and people that may not even live in that community or whoever you're trying to convince, is just the way to like get the narrative out there, but also not make it like, oh, look at our kids who are struggling, like not like, like pity, right? But like also like it's a tough line and it's a tough balance. But like, when people start to really think about it and think about the way that the kids want the message put out there, or the community wants the message put out there too, I just kind of really keep that all centered as well.
Let me add to that, because I had to learn that not everybody has my passion when it came to that. And that's when Dave mentioned staff, I would literally get pissed off at the second time that Guggenheim closed. We had some new teachers that came in, from the retired teachers, and I was getting irritated, and it wasn't about I'm going to lose my job, because in my mind, back then you can always get another job. It's not fair that this child has to get up, at 5 in the morning, get on a bus to be at a school 30, which is maybe 5, 10 miles from Chicago. It's like a 30, 40-minute ride. And then on the bus, now we're at another hour, and just wasn't fair. And so, my daughter didn't have to do it. So why should somebody else's child have to do it? You're always trying to find a way to make people understand, even though it's not happening in your household, it's still affecting your household because it's affecting your community. And so that was that. I still get, yeah, I still get irritated to this day. Even with my husband, sometimes it's like, do you not know me? It's hard if I can't get the narrative across to him, then that means I can't reach my coworkers and I can't reach the community and let them understand. So I start with him first a lot of times. And you really have to make sure that I had to learn not to beat myself up because somebody else didn't have that same passion. And then I also learned this from Matthew Luskin when I got to the current school that I'm at, because I almost went through this again when the other school closed, but we were off the chopping block when they ended up not closing schools. Find one common, everybody, you and I may be enemies, but let's find a commonality that we want to fight for. And that's what I had to do. I had to learn how to find that one thing in the building that pissed everybody off. And once I found that one thing in the building, and I would tell Matt, I don't know how to do that. Like, there's so many things that people are pissed off. He was like, figure it out. That's all he would ever say, figure it out. You got this. And I would have to find out that one thing, even if it was a small thing that pissed everybody off, and get a resolve to it and show them we can achieve this. Now let's tackle something else, until it got to the point where now we're all able to move as one. But it does become exhausting because your colleagues get exhausted, and then you're trying to keep the momentum of that fight. So at some point I had to learn that, okay, I have to take a step back. My passion is not everybody's passion. So that's one thing that I would suggest with the parents, and your students. Just find that one thing. And it may not be around school closing. It may be around lunch, the food. I think at one point there was a food strike at Roosevelt High School here in Chicago. Just if you could find that one thing that pissed parents off, that they can all rally around, and then maybe bring them out one night, feed them, have this conversation. It takes a minute to educate people, to get them to understand how this affects their community, because everybody's not into social justice. I didn't know it was social justice. I just knew I was getting mad that the school was closed and the poor kids had to go to a different school. So you start to learn things, and then when you're around other people like Dave, you hear everybody start talking, it's like, oh, that's a more refined way of saying that. So I would suggest that you find that commonality as well to start your fight, to build that momentum. And then don't be disheartened when everybody doesn't want to get up with you at 6 a.m, go pass out leaflets or go knock on doors or go canvass and things like that.
I wanted to add one thing when Kim was just talking too, is that when they closed 50 schools in 2013, but originally I think 2012 there was 125 schools on that list. And so that, again, kind of like the person who asked the question earlier, like, you guys are down to 5 schools, right? So we went down from 125 to 50. And so they being the people who are trying to close our schools, the privatizers, the people who are empowering them. They always would be like, oh, we're going to close 50 schools. Oh, no, but we're actually going to close 20. No, we're only going to close 5, right? And then it's the same cycle. And so, like I think Kim's, the example that she just gave of the one thing in the school, right? That is a beautiful example that you could use, the one thing in the community, right? The one thing in this and the one thing in that. And so then you start to get those wins, whether they're in the school or whether they're in a neighborhood or whether they're in your city. And then you figure out, okay, what city council member is supporting us for this win, right? And so then eventually the platform for the next person to run for city council is going to be, we're not closing schools. Like, that's their platform. And I remember the first time we got an alder person elected in Chicago who actually was like on our side. We're like, oh my God, like, this is absolutely amazing, right? Like, that was just one alder person out of 50, right? And so that was huge because it was so bad at that point. And so, I mean, you know, when we got a mayor, like we're all crying, but like that's a whole different level. But just the one win analogy that she just gave, I think is a great way to think about it, the whole shrub.
A question for Kim, if it's not too late for you, in Chicago, but it relates also to our situation. Just, I'm Philip, I'm a member of the Seattle chapter DSA. Just something Juliana said earlier made me think of something I want to ask Kim. Part of the enrollment crisis is how expensive Seattle is and the cost of housing. And we have contract negotiations. Our union has contract negotiations coming up this summer. And I remember hearing, but I was wondering if you could say more about this, Kim, that I think in the last CTU contract negotiations or in one round, CTU, one of its demands was to build more affordable housing in Chicago. And that was an education issue. And that's really thinking outside the box. Most people would say, well, that's not relevant for your bargaining with the school district. That's not a union issue. As Juliana was saying, it does affect our schools, that rents are going up, housing costs are going up, that's forcing people out, then enrollment's falling, and then we have a budget crisis. So, but I'm just curious if you could talk a little more about it with CTU. Am I right in my memory about that? And how did you do that? How did you make it relevant to your contract, your bargaining, like the school? Were you bargaining with the school board? And the school board is like, well, we have no power over that. How did you, and what was the result of that?
Correct. That's still a hard fight, even within our union, because some members, let me back up for a second. Some member feels as though we need to fight about bread and butter, class size, our pay, benefits, leave it alone. There's 30,000 members. The other members are saying, but we are teaching students who are homeless. And if our students are homeless and they're coming into the building, they're asleep, you know, we don't know, you don't know if they'll be here tomorrow because I've personally had a lot of students who are homeless. And so it was on the ballot, this last ballot. And because you asked me, I cannot think of the name. It was housing. We got it on the ballot. And I'm not going to say we, because those were other grassroots organizations that were alliances with CTU that we built that alliance with. Now, I want to say it was 48% on the ballot. Those who voted for, what was it called? It was called Bring Chicago Home. I think that's what the name of it was called, Bring Chicago Home. And it was about housing, making housing more affordable, because when you cannot afford to live within your community, of course, your neighborhood school is under enrolled quite naturally. And it was about 48% who voted for Bring Chicago Home. And then the question was, how would it be funded? You know, and that goes back to that passion again. Everybody's not share your same passion. So that is still our fight. We have several committees within CTU. We have a housing committee. We have a social justice committee, sustainable schools. I chair Chicago Teachers Union Political Action Committee, meaning that anybody who wants an endorsement has to come through my committee. I don't want to say my committee because I lean on my colleagues, but I just chair the committee, I co-chair it. So that is one of the hallmarks of a good majority of us within our union who are fighting for housing, fair housing, so that our students can have homes. And I hope that kind of, without me going off into my tangent, because I kind of felt myself getting irritated again. So I hope, did I do you justice? Did I answer your question? Just let me know.
What was the response? How did you make it a contract demand? I get you put a ballot.
Okay, I got you. Okay, so well, see, and okay, people always ask, how do we do things? That is, I promise you all, there's like a core, not core for lack of a better term, because that's what they're called, core, but there's a number of union members, teachers, and parents who actually stay up at night and read And they do research and they reach out, you know, and they go to social justice labor movements and things like that, and they bring back and they educate and they make it a contract demand by building up to the anticipation of the contract, and then they weave it in, and then they have those same talking points. And once again, it's politics. When you have those same talking points and you beat those talking points in, people begin to say, oh, you know what? Yeah, I do have a lot of homeless students in my building. You know, our students' learning conditions are our working conditions. And that's really how they built that in. And that's really how we built in a lot of social justice issues within our union, because it affects our students. And so, but again, you do have a small core of our, I don't want to give you all the illusion that every member is fighting for housing, because some members are well off, you know, and so it doesn't affect them. And so, you know, they don't have that same passion. I'm going to use that word passion. But yes, we have those talking points. Whereas, and you have to understand too, some of our teachers have said that they've been homeless, even while teaching, because it's expensive here too. You know, in the summertime, we go broke. You know, we're living with people. We're roommates. If you're a roommate, you're homeless. You don't have your own home. You know, so that's how we have talking points. And with these talking points, we just hit on them every time we speak, every time we're in front of a camera, every time we go somewhere, every time we have a union meeting, every time we have a House of Delegate meetings, we hit on these talking points until it becomes second nature to have someone out in Seattle talk about, you know, these talking points, you know, so that's what you do. You figure out the talking points and you just keep hitting on them. It's almost like the presidential election. These are the talking points, and then you begin to educate each other on these talking points. And Chicago CTU in the summer, and I don't want to take too much more of your time, have what they call Summer Institute, where they begin to, and they started that back in 2010, maybe. I think I was like the second class. I've taken it twice. And they use this as an opportunity to educate members within the union, and the members get a stipend, like a $600 stipend throughout the summer. And then when you go to class for like 6 weeks out the summer, and then you start door knocking other members. You just focus on the members, and you have conversations with them, and you try to gather what their concerns are at their schools, finding that commonality. So yeah, so it's just the talking points. And once you start zoning in on that talking point, it becomes a reality.